I wanted to break a little bit of interview protocol and just talk about my week.
Okay.
It's just, I rewatched Moonlight, you know the film?
I didn't see it.
Good. That's it.
Okay,
You don't need to,
okay.
but it's set in Liberty City in Florida.
Oh.
And then my girlfriend sent me a clip of another film with Willem Dafoe that's coming out called The Florida Project.
Uh-huh.
Set on the outside the...
That I did see the trailer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
About the girls in the motel who live outside Disneyland.
Yeah.
And then your book, and you have a book coming out called Orlando.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden my image of Florida just changed in a week that it can be a poetic place. It can be something. So what role has Florida played in your career in the way you write poetry?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that movie because the Florida Project, because I rarely go see movies, and I was looking through trailers and I wanted to see it, but it didn't have a chance. I think there's a kind of dark underside to Florida that people don't often associate with Florida. They think, oh, Disneyland, happy place, sunny all the time. And I think living there, you see a lot of the other side of the environmental problems that came with Disney World and the sort of destruction of the natural resources, things like that, and the hurricanes. Also the climate change and all of that stuff. So for me, Florida is a kind of paradoxical place. You know, on the one hand, it's very, people go for vacation, they go to have a good time, but there's also this kind of undercurrent there of a kind of darkness. There's a kind of violence to Florida and the history of the South. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of, in my book, Orlando, that's sort of the intersection between the two, the sort of highly commercialized spaces and the problems that the South has had. So that's sort of one of the things I look at in the poem.
You felt like it shaped your voice in any way, Florida? Because
yes, the landscape, because it's a very lush place. It's tropical. It rains all the time. I grew up in Los Angeles, but you know, it's very dry. Florida just seems to rain every single day. The hurricanes, this sort of, like this summer, I feel like we spent dodging hurricanes and driving away from hurricanes and all of that stuff. And last year, a tree fell on my house that I was living in the middle of the night, so it was terrifying, which is also in my book. So things like that, the kind of just different weather that I wasn't used to, and the sort of tropical landscape, yeah.
Talking about the voice, that's something that came out in the first poem of yours that I read. It's just the voice. Your voice is there, and I guess you can say that about all poetry, but yours is more, if I can say something like that. How does a poet find his own voice? How did you find your own voice as a poet?
That's a good question. I think it took a long time. For me, I guess this is helpful for students. I was always open to experimentation. So when I started writing at the beginning, I did a lot of experiments. I tried different things. If something didn't work, I tried something else. And I think eventually I came into my own voice just through experiment and through not being afraid of trying new things. You have a strong voice too, I noticed in your poem in the workshop today. But just, I think, you know, experimentation and play really does help with that. It doesn't seem like it would, but eventually you sort of learn to manipulate language and learn to modulate the tones and things like that. So eventually your voice kind of comes through, and a range like humor that we don't always associate with poetry, or wittiness, or, you know, all these kinds of different tenors that you can put in a poem, because I think range actually creates a kind of full sense of voice. So, yeah.
Is this humor and wittiness something that comes as a, does it come natural to you or during revision? Because do you revise this poetry, have a lot of revision in the process?
Yeah, I revise a lot later. I usually write things very quickly right away, and then maybe like 6 months to a year later, I go back to the poem and I try to unify the poem and make sure that it all sounds, of the same place. And, humor, I don't know where it comes from, maybe just sort of looking at the world a certain way and, kind of, I grew up, sort of wrote in the 90s where you could still use irony and things like that. It seems to have gone out of style completely, but
it's the form right now is irony.
Oh, you think so right now?
Or it's past that.
It's past.
It's gotten old.
It's gotten old, but so right now a lot of the poems are very straightforward, very sincere, one thing corresponds to another, but when I was learning to write, all of that, it was just a different time. So I think that irony often lends itself, satire and humor. So I like those. I like to add that to my poems.
And who were your biggest inspirations when you started writing?
Well, Sylvia Plath was one. She's not very funny. You don't really think of her as a funny poet. I like John Ashbery, Langston Hughes. I like a lot. Harriet Mullen was my teacher at UCLA, and I really loved her poetry. She's very playful. So I just have so many poets I admire for different reasons. Frank O'Hara, I love the New York School. Yeah.
You cite some really the poets from back then, like back then.
Like way back in the day.
Because if I got to be honest with you, you were my introduction to contemporary poetry. I haven't read much.
Okay.
So to see it, and it worked so well, to see a poem that works, that has the word selfie and Ovid in the same text.
Yeah, the high and the low.
Yeah, no, not the low. It's not low.
But is selfie low? No, maybe not. Maybe your selfies are higher than mine.
Sure. I mean, no, I don't think so.
You get to 40 and selfies aren't as fun anymore.
You take them from down here.
Yeah, you gotta like. You put it through the meat grinder of the filters.
Yeah.
That really helps. Yeah.
Did you ever feel reluctant to adding those, like phrases like OMG and selfies and emojis into your poem?
No.
Was that something that come naturally? You never felt any?
No, because I think that it's completely misguided to think that there's some kind of one poetic language. If you look at Dante or Milton or these, I'm sure that their poems included things that were, of their time, right? So I think this idea that somehow there's some timeless, universal subject and diction to poetry is like not true at all. So I mean, I think that my poems are political and they talk about what's in this world, not the world of 500 years ago. So, yeah.
People shouldn't limit themselves. So.
I don't think so, no, yeah.
And this might be a personal question, but how does it come to you? Does it serve as a discharge, poetry? Is it something that, because like this whole struggling artist idea is something that you have to just put it on the page to relieve yourself from it?
There's an aspect of that. I think that's an important aspect, inspiration, or these ideas that, of course. I think that, the workshop we did was very procedural and sort of, in some sense, not personal. Poetry is weird because it's so personal, but then it's not, You want to make a work of art, but it really does, the best poems really do often come from deeper sorts of emotional and psychological and, intellectual places. So I think that it's a balance, but if I think about how did I start writing poetry, well, it was in my diaries. So there's going to be an aspect of the personal that's important because I feel like that's what people oftentimes relate to on the emotional level. Poems are at their heart, about your soul, yeah.
Did it get any different? The stuff that you're doing today, that little girl writing the diary, is it different?
In some ways, yes, because I learned to craft and I learned how to manipulate language to an extent that it would, truly reflect what I want to do. So, when you don't have the tools, you get a lot of raw emotions and things like that, and maybe a good image here, a good image there. But I think what happens, and so I think of the language controls you. You know, you are controlled by the language because you don't have the control over it, because you don't have the tools. So I think what's you can learn is how to sort of wrestle. I mean, you make a movie, you know, as a young person, and you know, you have all these things you're working with. You have to learn how to use your tools, and so it's different. Yeah, it's different because it's easier to turn something that's okay into something really good, because I know how to move things around, and I read a lot of poetry too, and I teach it a lot. So, looking at other people's books and trying to figure, you know, how to move things around for them sort of helps me with my own poems.
And how do you deal with this inspiration, reading other people's poetry and other poetry? Does it, at any time, does it go directly into the poems that you write? Does it linger?
Inspiration?
Yeah.
It should go into the poems. I think that's what translates, right? Like if you're inspired, yeah. I mean, that's always the driving force of really, really good work, I think, is that thing that you don't know where it comes from. And maybe I'm a little romantic about it, because I still think that's important, because you feel it. So for me, I know when I can't write because I don't, you know, feel that energy. I don't know how to describe it, and there are long periods where I just don't, and that's okay. You know, I use another brain to revise the poems and all of that stuff. So.
Certain distance.
A certain distance, but the feeling of really, you know, the inspiration and that very like highly romantic feeling, you know, that feels like a gift, because I don't know where it comes from, and I know exactly how it feels, and it's a wonderful thing, and I don't ever want that to be beaten out of me or taken away, because it's really important for writing.
And how do you work for that not to be beaten out of you?
It's very hard,
yeah.
Especially having 2 young children, and you know, working, work a lot, so it's very hard. You know, you have to make time for it, and sometimes I can't, to be really honest. So it's just, I don't know, I think sort of when it comes, when you have that inspiration, really sitting down with it and really trying to write during that time is important, but it's not always possible.
What do you do when you can't?
It goes away sometimes, and that's really a sad thing for me. Yeah, I mean, it's just, life is what it is too, the material conditions of working, and those are real, you know. If 8-year-old and a 5-year-old, they have to eat dinner. It can't just be like, Mom's inspired to write a poem. So my fiance helps a lot.
How? Oh, with it, okay.
Yeah.
When the muse comes.
Yeah, but it's still like, it's noisy, and we live in a small apartment,
yeah.
So.
Has having children influenced your poetry at all?
Yeah, it has, because they come into my work. They're sort of, I don't know how they're going to feel about this later, but they're sort of characters in my poems. So I hope they don't resent me when they're older. But yeah.
And I've heard some artists and even stand-up comedians talk about the process of when it comes to your mind, there's a certain incubation period that happens where the poem or the stand-up set story idea is forming in it. Does that happen to you? And is there a value in not putting it directly on paper?
Yeah, actually, when you ask me that, what do you do when you're inspired and you can't write? Sometimes something it stays in your head, and I think good lines will often stay in my mind, and I know they're good lines because I can sit down 5 or 6 months later and realize, oh, I thought of this 6 months ago, and somehow the poem came together in my mind. And it's a very weird, almost strange thing, because I think that's why I write quickly, because so much of the work goes on in my head before I actually sit down and type it out the poem. Ideas, lines, things like that, they sort of, it's almost like a puzzle that kind of comes together in my mind. And so.
Do you think cell phones and this whole technological revolution has affected any way this process? 'Cause when you talk about the uninterrupted mind, you struggle with that in any way? Do you fight against it?
I think everyone does. Yeah, it's I notice when I'm not on my phone, don't use my phone very often, I feel more creative because I feel like, one of the things with the social media, it's almost like pulling this creative energy into these different channels. And I mean, sometimes that's a good thing and it's okay, but I think if it's too much, then it sort of dilutes the energy that you need for the artwork. So I think a lot of people struggle with that, the kind of demands that technology has. On the other hand, like the news and, reading about what's going on, that's important to my work because my work, I feel like, is fairly political. So, what do you think with the technology?
I'm horrible. I'm a victim of it.
Yeah.
So, I fight against it, try to.
Yeah, well, I hear that, they design it to be so addictive. So that's part of it's in the design of the stuff.
And what advice would you give to a poet who's just starting?
Oh my gosh.
What's something that you teach in your class that's peculiar to you? I'm sure there are many things, but...
Well, I've always been a little anti-authoritarian, so I usually tell them, don't listen to me. It's okay to...
There are teachers who are like that, and don't say that.
That it's okay to just, I'm going to teach this class this way, but another person's going to teach it maybe a completely different way, and that's okay. And that, I think as an artist, you sort of have to be arrogant in a way. Not arrogant, maybe that's not the right word, but, if I listened to everything that all my teachers told me, I wouldn't even be a poet anymore because, it would, I think at the end of the day, you just, you really have to follow, your vision of your work and listen to their advice, but then on the other hand, have trust your instincts. I think it's important, especially at the beginning, because that's what will keep you making art. Yeah.
Cool.
So,
Thanks for the advice and thanks for coming here.
Thank you.